Usually, when we talk about a major diplomatic negotiation, there's this expectation of like formal precision.
Right.
It's almost like architecture. You
Yeah.
draft the blueprints, everyone sits around a giant mahogany table in Geneva, they sip their bottled water, and eventually, after months of this really quiet, insulated deliberation, they sign a neat little document.
Yeah, it's methodical, it's safe. I mean, it is explicitly designed to be as sterile as possible,
Hmm.
right? Just so that emotions don't derail the geopolitical calculus.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of Middle Eastern geopolitics in late May of 2026, and suddenly that mahogany table is just entirely on fire.
Literally on fire.
Yeah, we're looking at a diplomatic landscape that is genuinely heart-pounding. I mean, we are talking about diplomats trying to finalize a peace deal while military strikes are actively, literally still happening in the background.
It's the absolute definition of diplomacy under fire. It is a profoundly high-wire act. There's zero safety net here. They're operating in an environment where, a single errant drone strike or even a misinterpreted radar signal could collapse the entire negotiation in an afternoon.
Which brings us to today's mission for you, the listener. We are unpacking one of the most fluid, globally significant, and honestly highly volatile geopolitical events happening right now. And that's the ongoing negotiations for a U.S.-Iran peace framework.
Yes.
And we have a mountain of material we're working from today. It's this really meticulous compilation of public reporting, official government statements from both Washington and Tehran, and real-time market reactions, all gathered over the course of May 2026.
And, looking at that compilation, it becomes immediately obvious that the information is just wildly contradictory.
Oh, yeah. Completely depends on who happens to be standing at the podium.
Exactly. So the objective for our deep dive here is to cut through the domestic political spin coming out of both capitals. We want to help you understand the actual physical mechanics of this proposed Memorandum of Understanding.
We really have to look past the rhetoric and look at the gears turning underneath.
Right, because the rhetoric is just noise right now.
Right. Because before we can even talk about the terms of this deal, we really have to talk about the violent, chaotic road that led us to May 2026. I mean, you cannot understand this framework without understanding the immediate context that forced these two sides to the table in the first place.
No, you can't.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to me, it sounds like trying to negotiate a fire insurance policy while the kitchen is still actively smoldering. The timeline of recent escalation is just staggering. If we rewind just a bit to 2025, there were indirect and direct negotiations happening, right? Meditated by Oman and a few other players.
Yeah, there were.
But those completely broke down.
They did break down, and that collapse is really the foundational context for everything we are seeing now. When diplomatic channels between historic adversaries just evaporate, it doesn't just result in a quiet stalemate.
It creates a vacuum.
Exactly. It creates a massive vacuum. And in this specific region, vacuums are invariably filled by kinetic force. I mean, the failure of the 2025 talks meant that the guardrails were totally gone, and that led directly to a rapid escalation in Israeli and U.S. strikes targeting Iranian assets and proxy networks.
Which culminated in what the intelligence and market reports are explicitly referring to as the 2026 Iran war, which kicked off in late February. And I want to pause on that reality for a second. We aren't talking about a Cold War of angry press releases here.
No, not at all.
We are talking about a hot war. Missiles flying, infrastructure being hit. The disruption to the entire region was massive.
Yeah, and a hot war fundamentally alters the psychology of a negotiation. It shifts the priority from, long-term strategic posturing to immediate desperate triage.
Right.
By the time we hit early April 2026, the sheer cost of that conflict forced to pivot. A temporary ceasefire was finally achieved. But the mechanics of how that ceasefire happened are fascinating, particularly if you look at the mediation landscape.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Because the primary broker that managed to freeze the conflict wasn't just the usual suspects. It was notably mediated by Pakistan.
Okay, I've got to push back on the mechanics of that because that specific detail jumped out at me in the sources. With missiles actively flying in February and March, how do you even establish a communication channel?
It's incredibly difficult.
I mean, how does a mediator like Pakistan step into an active war zone and get both sides to sit in the same metaphorical room? Or at least, pick up the phone without hanging up? Why Pakistan?
It comes down to a very unique set of geopolitical levers that very few nations possess. If you look at Pakistan's geographic and diplomatic positioning, it is essentially a masterclass in acting as a regional fulcrum.
Okay.
First, there's the geography. Pakistan shares a massive, highly porous, and historically complex border with Iran. So an unstable Iran, or a hot war inside Iran, is an immediate existential security threat to Islamabad.
Ah, so they have an absolute vested interest in stopping the fire before it jumps the property line.
Exactly. They can't afford to just watch it burn. But simultaneously, Pakistan maintains a long-standing, heavily entrenched military and intelligence relationship with the United States.
Right, of course.
The Pakistani military has direct lines to the Pentagon that completely bypass standard diplomatic bureaucracy. Furthermore, and this is key, Pakistan is a declared nuclear-armed state.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that changes the dynamic.
It really does. In the hierarchy of global diplomacy, possessing a nuclear deterrent inherently commands a different level of strategic respect, particularly in a crisis involving, potential nuclear escalation.
So they aren't just a neutral message carrier. They have actual skin in the game and the military weight to demand attention.
Right. When nations like Oman or Qatar mediate, and they are heavily involved in the current framework as well, they function brilliantly as neutral, quiet back channels. They provide those safe mahogany tables we talked about.
Right, the bottled water diplomacy.
Exactly. Pakistan, however, brings a heavy regional gravity. They can essentially call Tehran and say, look, we are your neighbors, we understand the regional dynamics, but you need to stop this. And they can call Washington and say, we are a strategic partner, and this escalation is destabilizing our nuclear-armed borders.
It's that dual leverage.
Yes, that dual leverage is what allowed them to broker the April ceasefire.
They basically force the window open. And climbing through that window is a very specific, high-level cast of characters driving these May negotiations. We're seeing U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and President Trump actively involved. And then on the Iranian side, you have heavyweights like Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi.
Yeah, and the presence of those specific individuals tells you exactly what kind of negotiation this is.
What do you mean?
Well, you do not deploy the Secretary of State, highly visible special envoys, and the president's immediate orbit for, exploratory talks.
Right.
You deploy them when you're trying to force an immediate, tangible result. It is high-pressure, top-down diplomacy.
But that brings us to the actual structure of what they're trying to sign, because the kitchen is still smoldering, and trust between Washington and Tehran is practically, well, negative. So a grand, sweeping, historical treaty seems mechanically impossible right now.
It is entirely impossible. A treaty is built on a foundation of long-term mutual assurance. You cannot realistically ask two nations who were actively exchanging fire weeks ago to suddenly map out their relationship for the next 50 years.
Right, and bind themselves to it in international law.
Exactly. The domestic politics in both countries simply wouldn't survive it.
Which naturally dictates the specific segmented architecture of this current framework. All the documentation and reporting we're looking at is very clear on this point. What they are negotiating is not a final comprehensive treaty. It is a phased Memorandum of Understanding, an MU.
And the mechanical distinction between a treaty and an MU is absolutely critical to understanding how this de-escalation actually works. In international relations, a treaty is a massive, legally binding commitment.
Right.
It requires formal ratification. In the U.S., that means passing the Senate. It is comprehensive, and it implies a permanent resolution of underlying issues.
It's the grand, legally binding marriage.
Yes.
Yeah.
But a MOU, particularly a phased MOU like the one currently on the table, operates on entirely different legal and psychological tracks.
Okay, how so?
It is essentially an executive agreement. It is a mutual written acknowledgement of a step-by-step process. It is custom-built for low-trust, high-hostility environments. The mechanics of a phased approach allow both sides to test compliance in small, highly verifiable increments.
Basically, I take one microstep back, and I watch to see if you take one microstep back.
Exactly.
So instead of getting married with a grand treaty, they are agreeing to just date exclusively for 30 days to see if they can survive in the same room without throwing plates at each other.
It's risk mitigation at its core. If you structure an agreement in 10 phases and the opposing side cheats or reneges on phase 1, you haven't permanently compromised your national security or committed to phase 10. You just halt the process and walk away.
But let me challenge the effectiveness of that, because President Trump stated publicly on May 23rd and 24th that the agreement was, quote, largely negotiated. Yet we are looking at the realities on the ground, and no immediate signing has actually occurred.
Right.
So if an MOU is just a series of small, non-binding micro steps, is this just a fancy geopolitical way of kicking the can down the road because they literally cannot figure out how to solve the truly difficult stuff?
I mean, that is the most persistent criticism leveled at phase diplomacy.
Hmm.
Are you actually solving the conflict, or are you just buying a temporary pause?
Yeah.
To answer that, you have to look at the mechanical reality of what those initial steps actually are.
Mhm.
If phase one is just an agreement to hold more meetings, then yes, it's kicking the can.
Right.
But when you look at the specific terms of phase one in this 2026 framework, which is designed to play out over the next 30 to 60 days, the immediate steps are massive, globally impactful physical actions.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Because phase one isn't about scheduling meetings. It focuses on resolving two massive acute choke points. First, the Strait of Hormuz, and second, Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium.
Yes.
Let's start with the physical reality of Hormuz. The framework dictates that Iran agrees to allow safe navigation, clear sea mines, and fully restore commercial shipping. And if you are wondering why this matters to your local economy or, your gas prices next month, we really have to lay out the stakes of this waterway.
The economic gravity of the Strait of Hormuz dictates global financial stability. We are talking about a narrow, highly vulnerable waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the open ocean.
Right.
Roughly 20% of the entire world's global oil trade, plus massive amounts of liquefied natural gas, passes through this single, incredibly narrow bottleneck.
1/5 of the planet's energy supply relies on a channel that, at its narrowest point, is only about 21 miles wide.
And the shipping lanes themselves are only a couple of miles wide in either direction, because the water needs to be deep enough for massive supertankers.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the depth requirement.
Yeah, so during the hot war that erupted in February, Iran effectively blockaded it. They utilized a combination of naval harassment, fast attack craft, and the deployment of naval mines to shut down that transit route.
Which acts like a heart attack for the global supply chain. Tankers just freeze in port, maritime insurance premiums skyrocket to the point where shipping becomes economically unviable, and the cost of everything tied to energy goes completely haywire.
Exactly.
So physically reopening that specific waterway is priority number one for the global economy.
But the mechanics of reopening it are a synchronized logistical nightmare. In exchange for Iran reopening the strait and physically clearing those mines, the U.S. has to make immediate, tangible, verifiable concessions.
What kind of concessions?
The U.S. agrees to lift its naval blockade of Iranian ports, it allows for freer Iranian oil sales on the global market, and it grants partial sanctions waivers, which crucially involves the unfreezing of billions in Iranian assets held in international accounts.
Wow. And while all of this maritime and economic maneuvering is happening, both sides have to formally extend the April ceasefire and actively wind down hostilities on all fronts, which includes reining in related fighting involving Iranian-backed groups in places like Lebanon.
Yeah, and you really have to visualize how this actually plays out on the water. Lifting a U.S. naval blockade is mechanically straightforward. The Pentagon issues an order, the carrier strike groups and destroyers stand down, and they allow commercial traffic to approach Iranian ports. It is an immediate policy shift.
Okay.
Clearing sea mines, however, which is Iran's responsibility in phase one, is a grueling, highly dangerous, and time-consuming physical operation. Naval mines aren't just floating barrels, They're often sophisticated, acoustic, or magnetic devices sitting on the sea floor. Finding them and neutralizing them requires specialized vessels mapping the seabed inch by inch.
So it's an incredibly tense de-escalation. Both sides have to lower their weapons at the exact same millimeter per second. But one side's weapon is a digital bank transfer unfreezing assets, and the other side's weapon is an invisible explosive hidden underwater.
That's a great way to put it.
And if a single commercial tanker hits a mist mine on day 25 of this 30-day window, the entire MOU just collapses.
Exactly. The margin for error is effectively zero. And if coordinating a massive naval demining operation while simultaneously lifting global banking sanctions wasn't complicated enough, we hadn't even touched the most volatile element of phase one yet.
Right, the uranium. The framework demands that within this same initial window, Iran must dispose of or transfer its existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium, its HEU.
I really had to challenge the logistical reality of this.
How do you verify the disposal of highly enriched uranium in a tight 30 to 60-day window while you are simultaneously trying to clear sea mines and negotiate the release of frozen funds? It just sounds mechanically impossible to execute that quickly.
The logistics of verifying HEU disposal are incredibly intricate. You don't just put it in a box and ship it out overnight via FedEx. In nuclear diplomacy, quote-unquote disposal typically involves two possible mechanisms.
Okay, what's the first?
The first is physical transfer out of the country. This usually means moving the material to a third-party nation like Russia or another trusted neutral actor. This requires specialized transport casks, immense security protocols, and strict, continuous supervision by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA.
I imagine every single gram has to be weighed, tracked, and sealed.
Precisely. And the second mechanism is chemical downblending.
What is that?
This is where Iranian scientists, under IAEA observation, would chemically mix the highly enriched uranium with natural or depleted uranium. This process physically alters the material, so it is no longer highly enriched and cannot be used in a weapon without starting the entire enrichment process over from scratch.
Okay.
But both of these mechanisms require inspectors on the ground, live camera feeds reconnected, tamper-proof seals installed, and total unhindered transparency.
In 30 to 60 days, while the memory of military strikes from a few weeks prior is still completely fresh in the minds of the people facilitating the inspections.
Which is exactly why this specific step is the defining friction point of the entire negotiation. Trying to synchronize the clearing of mines, the lifting of blockades, and the downblending of nuclear material under extreme time pressure is proving incredibly difficult.
I can imagine.
And it brings us to the core reason why, despite the optimism in late May, a final signature hasn't materialized yet. When you look at the situation, there's a massive gulf between the physical reality of these sticking points and the rhetoric being broadcast to the public.
Yeah, let's get into the mechanics of that rhetoric. Because reading the official statements from Washington versus Tehran feels like watching two completely different movie trailers for the exact same film.
That framing is exactly right. The public posturing reveals several massive discrepancies in how the framework is being interpreted. Let's look at the Strait of Hormuz again. Everyone agrees it needs to reopen. But the legal mechanism of how it reopens is heavily contested.
Oh, really?
Yes.
No.
Iran views the strait through the lens of strict territorial sovereignty. They want complete control over the waterway, and there are strong indications they want the right to collect transit tolls, treating the strait almost like a national highway.
Wait, tolls. While the U.S. and its allies are demanding unrestricted, guaranteed freedom of navigation. And that isn't just a preference. I mean, that is a foundational tenet of international maritime law and U.S. naval doctrine globally.
Right.
You can't just slap a toll booth on an international strait that handles a fifth of the world's oil supply. If the U.S. concedes to tolls there, it sets a precedent for every other contested waterway on Earth.
And that legal clash over maritime sovereignty is massive. But the discrepancy regarding the nuclear deferment is even larger and, honestly, far more politically explosive.
How so?
The U.S. administration is aggressively highlighting the disposal of that highly enriched uranium as a central, immediate, locked-in victory for Phase 1. They are projecting a narrative to the American public that says, look, we forced them to the table and we are getting the most dangerous material out of their hands immediately.
But the Iranian accounts are actively publicly downplaying that exact same provision. I mean, Iranian officials, specifically from their foreign ministry, are firmly stating that this initial MOU does not lock in any major changes to their nuclear infrastructure.
Exactly.
They are loudly insisting on their inalienable right to enrich uranium under Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. So Trump is publicly stating the deal is largely negotiated, while the Iranian foreign ministry is stating that no major structural concessions have been made. So how do the actual diplomats sitting in the room reconcile these completely contradictory public narratives? Who is playing to their domestic audience more here?
Honestly, both. They reconcile it through the art of strategic ambiguity. It is vital to understand the intense domestic pressure both sides are operating under.
Okay, let's look at the U.S. side first.
In the United States, the administration has to navigate a deeply skeptical political base and hawkish lawmakers who strongly favor a strategy of maximum pressure. Any agreement that even slightly resembles a concession or a weakening of sanctions without total Iranian capitulation will face brutal domestic scrutiny.
Especially because Israeli security concerns are a massive factor in U.S. domestic politics.
Precisely. Therefore, the U.S. administration has no choice but to frame this MOU as a decisive, hardline victory that instantly neutralizes an acute nuclear threat.
They essentially have to sell it as a surrender to the hawks in Washington.
Yes. Conversely, the Iranian negotiators are returning to a capital dominated by hardliners. Now, yes, there is profound war fatigue across Iran. The domestic protests and the severe economic distress caused by the February conflict are very real pressures forcing them to negotiate.
Right.
However, the ideological core of the Iranian establishment simply cannot appear to be surrendering its sovereign rights under military duress. The right to enrich uranium is not just a technical capability to them. It has been elevated to a matter of fierce national pride and technological independence.
So they have a narrative they need to maintain, too.
They must frame this milieu to their domestic audience as a victory of resistance, a narrative where Iran successfully withstood a war and forced the U.S. to lift a naval blockade without surrendering their core nuclear infrastructure.
So the diplomats are basically tasked with drafting a document that is mechanically functional, yet linguistically vague enough that both Washington and Tehran can go back to their respective capitals, hold a press conference, and declare total, uncompromising victory.
Precisely. But the inherent danger of strategic ambiguity is that it rapidly erodes trust the moment implementation begins.
Oh, for sure.
When both sides have completely different public expectations of what they just agreed to, the smallest technical hiccup can be interpreted as a massive betrayal. And the history of betrayal and mistrust here is profound.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you cannot look at these negotiations without acknowledging the massive ghost haunting the entire process. And that's 2018.
Yes.
The U.S. withdrawal from the original 2015 JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Obama-era deal, that history deeply complicates any attempt to build new verification mechanisms today. Plus, you have the ongoing violence. We are talking about recent U.S. strikes that the U.S. firmly categorizes as defensive actions to protect its assets, but which Iran categorizes as explicit violations of the April ceasefire.
Right. And to truly grasp why verification is such a nightmare, and why this specific stockpile of highly enriched uranium is the absolute center of gravity for Phase 1, we have to look closely at that ghost. We need to mechanically compare the realities of the 2026 framework to the architecture of the 2015 JCPOA.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that 2015 deal because it really sets the entire baseline for why the current situation is so incredibly dangerous. The JCPOA was a comprehensive, multilateral behemoth of a treaty. It wasn't just the U.S. and Iran.
No.
It involved the UK, France, Germany, Russia, China, and the EU. It was a globally coordinated effort to put a structural freeze on Iran's nuclear ambitions.
And the terms of that freeze were highly specific and fundamentally different from what is happening in 2026. Under the JCPOA, Iran's uranium enrichment was strictly capped at 3.67%. Furthermore, their total allowed stockpile of that low-enriched uranium, or LEU, was limited to just 300 kilograms. It also mandated physical, drastic cuts to their enrichment infrastructure, forcing them to reduce their active centrifuges from around 19,000 down to roughly 6,000, and heavily restricting them to older, less efficient centrifuge models.
But the critical flaw, or at least the most debated element, was the sunsets, right?
Yes.
Many of those strict limits and infrastructure caps were set to expire after 10 to 15 years. The theory was that after a decade of compliance and economic integration, the nature of the Iranian regime might shift, and they could eventually be allowed to reach industrial-scale civilian enrichment.
That was the hope.
But President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the deal in 2018, specifically citing those sunsets, along with the fact that the deal completely ignored Iran's development of ballistic missiles and their funding of regional proxy groups as fatal flaws that made the treaty unacceptable.
And the mechanical reality of what happened post-withdrawal is exactly what the 2026 negotiators are staring down today. After the U.S. left the agreement and reimposed crippling sanctions, Iran systematically, step by step, began breaching the limits of the JCPOA.
They didn't just drift slightly over the 3.67% cap, did they?
No, they actively ramped up their enrichment levels to 20% and then eventually to 60%.
I really want to unpack this 60% number because I think when a lot of people hear the progression of percentages, 3%, 20%, 60%, 90%, they naturally assume it's a linear scale.
Yeah, that's a common misconception.
Like driving a car, going from 30 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour takes the same amount of time as going from 0 to 30. But in nuclear physics, it's not a linear progression at all, is it?
Not even close.
Yeah.
It is a highly nonlinear exponential curve. To understand why 60% is so terrifying, you have to understand the mechanics of enrichment.
Break it down for us.
The process involves taking uranium hexafluoride gas and spinning it at supersonic speeds in cascades of centrifuges. The goal is to separate the heavier U-238 isotopes from the slightly lighter fissile U-235 isotopes.
And the U-235 is the unstable isotope that actually sustains the chain reaction. It's the stuff that makes the boom.
Yes. Natural uranium mined from the Earth contains less than 1% of that fissile U-235. The vast majority of the effort in uranium enrichment, what physicists measure in separative work units, or SWU, is spent just getting that natural uranium up to the 3.67% level required for a standard civilian nuclear power plant.
Wow.
That initial jump from less than 1% to just under 4% requires moving massive volumes of gas and represents roughly 70 to 80% of the total energy and time required to reach weapons-grade material.
That is mind-blowing. So the hardest, most time-consuming part of building a nuclear weapon is just getting to the 3% civilian level?
Exactly. Once you have a stockpile of 3.67%, you have already done the heavy lifting. Taking that 3.67% and enriching it further to 20%, which is used for medical research reactors, takes you even further up the curve.
Yeah.
We're going from 20% to 60%.
Yeah.
You are now standing on the threshold. 60% enriched uranium has virtually no practical civilian application. It is universally understood by the international community as a deliberate stepping stone to 90%, which is weapons grade.
Oh, I see.
Because the material is already so highly refined, the actual time and centrifuge effort required to jump from 60% to 90% is incredibly small. It can be achieved in a matter of weeks, if not days, in a relatively small, hidden facility.
So when the intelligence assessments note that Iran accumulated over 400 kilograms of this 60% highly enriched uranium following the collapse of the 2018 deal, that explains why the diplomatic panic is so acute now. In 2015, negotiators were managing low-level civilian-grade material and long timelines. In 2026, diplomats are staring down a massive stockpile of near-weapons-grade material that has dramatically shortened the breakout time, the physical time it takes to enrich enough 90% material for a single nuclear device to almost zero.
That is the defining terror of the 60% stockpile. It fundamentally changes the leverage dynamics. And that is why the architecture of the 2026 framework is so completely different from 2015.
Right.
The 2015 deal was a global, decade-long structural freeze on a nascent program. The 2026 deal is a bilateral-heavy post-conflict emergency brake. It lacks automatic 10-year sunsets because it hasn't even established a basic long-term baseline yet. The entire MOU is urgently focused on the immediate disposal of that specific 60% stockpile. It is trying to solve a crisis that simply did not exist a decade ago.
And the debate over whether this emergency brake actually makes the world safer is fierce. We have to look at the two primary schools of thought neutrally here. You have the hawkish view, and you have the deeply skeptical view of this 2026 phased MU.
Let's examine the hawkish perspective first, which is the narrative the U.S. administration is heavily promoting. This viewpoint argues that, structurally, the 2026 deal is actually much stronger and more realistic than the 2015 deal.
How so?
The argument hinges on leverage. They point out that the U.S. forced the immediate disposal of the most dangerous, highly enriched uranium as a prerequisite, rather than a long-term goal. Furthermore, they argue the U.S. is negotiating from a position of overwhelming post-war strength.
Because of the February conflict.
Right. The war inflicted severe economic damage on Iran, and military strikes likely degraded some of their physical, nuclear, and proxy infrastructure. From this viewpoint, the maximum pressure campaign worked. It forced a weakened adversary to surrender their most dangerous asset just to survive.
But then you have the skeptic view. And the skeptics look at the mechanics of this MOU and say, hold on, if this deal relies on rushed, vague verification rules because everyone is desperate to sign a ceasefire in 30 days, and it ultimately just settles for allowing Iran to maintain a limited enrichment capability, then it hasn't solved anything. It just echoes all the original flaws of the JCPOA, but with less international oversight.
And the skeptics point to a much deeper, more intractable problem, which is technological permanence.
This brings me to my toothpaste analogy.
Oh, let's hear it.
I look at Iran's nuclear progression, and it looks like trying to aggressively squeeze toothpaste back into the tube. Under the terms of this MOU, the U.S. can force Iran to take those 400 kilograms of 60% uranium, load it onto a cargo plane, and fly it to Russia. You can physically remove the material. But you cannot fly the knowledge of how to build advanced centrifuge cascades out of the minds of the Iranian nuclear scientists.
That is the crux of the skeptics' argument. In 2015, Iran's nuclear scientists were still largely learning how to master and stabilize advanced centrifuge models. The JCPOA forced them to use older, inefficient IR-1 centrifuges. But by 2026, after years of operating outside those constraints, they have completely mastered the advanced models. They possess advanced post-JCPOA institutional know-how. If this new MOU collapses 6 months from now, the reconstitution of that 60% stockpile would be exponentially faster today than it would have been a decade ago, because the engineering learning curve has already been permanently flattened.
So what is the actual strategic value here? I mean, if Iran already possesses the irreversible knowledge and the advanced infrastructure to enrich to 60% almost at will, does simply taking away their current physical stockpile actually make the Middle East safer in the long term? Or does this entire painful negotiation literally just buy the U.S. and its allies a few months of breathing room before the exact same cycle of escalation starts all over again?
That is the trillion-dollar question at the heart of modern nonproliferation. From a tactical standpoint, taking away the physical stockpile absolutely makes the region safer in the immediate present. By removing the near-weapons-grade material, you forcibly reset the physical breakout timeline from a matter of days back to a matter of months.
Okay, so it resets the clock.
You put precious time back on the diplomatic clock. But to your point, it does not and cannot erase the underlying capability, which is why this framework is explicitly designed not to stop at Phase 1. If they can somehow survive the absolute tightrope walk of the first 60 days, if they successfully clear the sea mines, unfreeze the funds, and downblend the uranium without a miscalculation, the framework is mandated to transition to Phase 2.
And Phase 2 is where the mechanics of this deal suddenly pull the camera all the way back. Because if Phase 1 is essentially about putting out the immediate kitchen fire, Phase 2 is an incredibly ambitious attempt to redesign the entire regional chessboard.
The long-term elements proposed in this framework are staggeringly broad. The goal is that within 30 to 60 days after the initial de-escalation steps are verified, both sides agree to immediately transition into comprehensive structural negotiations.
On the nuclear side, the goals for Phase 2 are massive. They want to negotiate a formal, permanent moratorium on any high-level enrichment. They want to restore full, unhindered IAEA inspections. And crucially, they want to re-implement what is called the additional protocol.
Yeah.
Explain what that actually means mechanically, because that term gets thrown around a lot in the reporting. What does the additional protocol allow inspectors to physically do?
The additional protocol is the gold standard of nuclear verification. Standard IAEA safeguards only allow inspectors to visit declared known nuclear facilities. It's essentially auditing the books you hand them.
Right.
The additional protocol grants inspectors vastly expanded legal authority and physical access. It allows them to conduct snap or short-notice inspections of any facility, declared or undeclared, if they suspect illicit nuclear activity.
Oh, wow. Any facility.
Yes. It allows for extensive environmental sampling, like swabbing the walls of a military base to look for microscopic traces of enriched uranium. It is the most intrusive verification regime in existence, and locking that in is a primary goal for Phase 2.
But the evolution here is that the nuclear issue is no longer being treated in isolation. In the 2015 deal, the negotiators deliberately walled off the nuclear talks from Iran's other regional activities to get the deal done. Phase 2 of the 2026 framework does the exact opposite.
It does.
It aims for broader economic normalization, extensive U.S. sanctions relief, and the structural reintegration of Iran into the global economy. But the catch is absolute regional integration.
Which represents a monumental strategic gamble. The reporting notes that President Trump has explicitly and publicly linked the success of this permanent deal to a broader de-escalation involving Iranian proxy groups across the Middle East. Furthermore, he has tied the economic normalization of Iran to an expansion of the Abraham Accords.
And the Abraham Accords, originally signed in 2020, were the agreements that normalized diplomatic relations between Israel and several Arab states, like the UAE and Bahrain. The 2026 framework envisions bringing even more major players into this diplomatic fold. We are talking about heavily involving Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey as active regional stakeholders in this U.S.-Iran peace process.
By linking the nuclear issue to proxy behavior and Arab-Israeli normalization, the U.S. is attempting an integration of unprecedented scale. They are saying that a nuclear deal is no longer just a nuclear deal.
Right.
The lifting of banking sanctions in Tehran is now explicitly tied to the behavior of Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Houthis in Yemen, or militia groups in Iraq. It is tied to how Saudi Arabia and Turkey calculate their own security architectures in response to an economically revived Iran.
I look at the mechanics of this Phase 2 and I see a giant, incredibly unstable game of geopolitical Jenga. You have this massive tower built out of decades of proxy warfare, covert nuclear ambition, crippling economic sanctions, and deep historical enmity between all these nations.
Yeah.
It sounds like the diplomats are trying to carefully slide the nuclear threat block out from the very bottom of the tower and simultaneously replace it with an economic normalization block and an Abraham Accords block, hoping they can swap the foundation without the entire Middle East collapsing in on itself.
It is a profoundly delicate operation. The theory behind this linkage is that by tying everything together, you create a web of mutual deterrence. If Iran's economic survival is tied to regional stability, they will theoretically rein in their proxies. If Saudi Arabia and the UAE are involved in the economic integration, they are less likely to pursue their own covert nuclear programs in response to Iran.
But I have to ask about the inherent fragility of that linkage. Does tying the nuclear deal to the Abraham Accords and proxy behavior actually make the peace more stable because everyone suddenly has economic skin in the game? Or does it just mean that instead of one way for the deal to fail, there are now 50 different ways for the whole thing to violently collapse?
That is the risk, absolutely.
What happens if one rogue proxy commander in Syria decides to launch a rocket at an American base on a random Tuesday? Does the entire nuclear agreement disintegrate?
That is the massive vulnerability of a comprehensive link strategy. When every geopolitical node is connected, a localized failure can instantly cascade through the entire system. If an Iranian-backed group acts up in Lebanon, the immediate political reaction in Washington will be immense.
Right, the political fallout.
The U.S. Congress would likely demand the immediate reimposition of sanctions. The moment sanctions are snapped back, the economic normalization block is pulled out, the nuclear moratorium collapses, Iran spins the centrifuges back up to 60%, and they immediately shut down the Strait of Hormuz again. The interconnectivity provides profound diplomatic leverage, but it creates a system with terrifying fragility.
It's an astronomical high-stakes gamble. It is betting that the promise of mutual economic survival can somehow override decades of deeply entrenched ideological and religious conflict.
Which perfectly summarizes the mechanical reality of the situation we are looking at. To wrap up our analysis of this incredibly complex framework, we are analyzing a highly fluid, exceptionally fragile diplomatic maneuver. This is not a straightforward, optimistic revival of past treaties.
Not at all.
It is a phased memorandum of understanding born out of absolute, immediate post-war necessity. It is a document entirely focused on executing fast, critical, physical wins, like clearing naval mines to reopen the vital economic artery of the Strait of Hormuz, and rapidly neutralizing the acute, immediate threat of a highly enriched uranium stockpile.
While deliberately, and perhaps mechanically necessarily, deferring the most deeply entrenched ideological and complex regional conflicts for a phase two that may or may not ever successfully materialize in the real world.
It is, in every sense of the word, diplomacy by triage. You stop the bleeding first and you worry about physical therapy later.
It really is. And as we wrap up this exploration of the framework, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on, something that builds on the incredible underlying tension we've been unpacking today. When you look at the raw data surrounding this negotiation, you see massive fluctuations in global oil prices. You see reports of severe domestic protests and economic distress inside Iran. And you see a profound overarching war fatigue on all sides following the heavy kinetic conflict in February.
It's a lot of pressure.
If you step back and look at the actual mechanics of what is forcing these nations to the table, if the true drivers of this MOU aren't a genuine desire for long-term ideological reconciliation or a newfound belief in peace, if they are simply driven by mutual exhaustion and the sheer terror of a global economic collapse, it raises a fascinating and somewhat disturbing question about the future.
Yeah.
How durable can a peace agreement actually be if it is built entirely on fatigue? Can sheer physical exhaustion successfully substitute for actual trust?
It's a profound question about the structural limits of modern diplomacy. When the exhaustion inevitably fades and the economies recover, what keeps the deal alive if the trust was never built?
Can you negotiate a lasting fire insurance policy when everyone is just simply too tired to hold the fire hose anymore? We highly encourage you to keep a very close eye on the maritime reports coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, watch the updates from regional mediators like Pakistan, and see how the mechanics of this 30 to 60-day window actually unfold in the real world. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the 2026 U.S.-Iran framework. We will catch you next time.